You're sitting in a crowd of 80,000 people. The sun is beating down. There's food in your hand, music in the air, and the whole city is here. Then a man dies in front of you, and everyone cheers. That's the image we have of ancient Rome. A civilization so bloodthirsty it turned murder into a spectator sport just because it could. But here's what almost nobody tells you. That image is almost entirely wrong, and the truth is so much darker. This video is about the real psychology behind the Roman arena. We're going to look at where it actually came from, what was really happening inside those walls, and what it says about human nature that still applies today. The conventional story is that Romans were just brutal people who loved watching death. But the actual story is this: the gladiator fights everyone pictures. 2 warriors, 1 survives, were the least deadly part of the whole event. The stuff that should genuinely disturb you barely gets mentioned, and it starts not with entertainment at all, but with a funeral. Let's start with the part that flips the whole premise. The famous gladiator duel. 2 fighters, crowd screaming, thumbs up or down, almost never ended in death. We actually know this with surprising precision. Painted fight results on the walls of Pompeii show that in the 1st century AD, roughly 1 in 5 gladiator fights ended in a fatality. 1 in 5. The other 4 fighters walked out alive. The reason wasn't mercy, it was money. A trained gladiator was an enormously expensive asset. Years of feeding, housing, medical care, specialized training. Killing one the first time he lost would be like a modern sports franchise executing their star player after 1 bad game. The business model ran on survival, not slaughter. The Emperor Augustus actually banned fights to the death outright, not for ethical reasons, but because they were ruinously expensive. Even Julius Caesar's contemporaries complained that killing a good fighter was a waste. And that famous image of the crowd pointing thumbs down to demand a death? Almost certainly invented. The gesture we all picture comes largely from a single 19th century painting, not from Roman evidence. The actual signal used is genuinely uncertain. So the Hollywood version, constant slaughter, blood everywhere, death on demand, is simply wrong. But here's the thing, the real story isn't less dark because of that. It's darker, because the gladiator fights were never really the point. Go back to 264 BC, the very first recorded gladiatorial bout in Rome. It wasn't staged at an arena. It wasn't funded by the state. It was held at a funeral. 3 pairs of fighters in a cattle market, organized by the sons of a man named Junius Brutus Pera, to honor their dead father. The Latin word for these games, munus, literally means a duty owed to the dead. The early Christian writer Tertullian described gladiatorial combat bluntly as human sacrifice. The blood spilled was believed to feed and appease the spirit of the deceased. People weren't watching for thrills, they were performing a religious offering. And because these games were private expenses, paid for by families, not the state, they created a loophole that changed Roman politics forever. Unlike chariot races, which required official funding, anyone with money could throw funeral games. You didn't need a government position. You just needed a dead relative and deep pockets. So ambitious men started competing. In 216 BC, 22 pairs fought at one funeral. By 183 BC, 60 pairs. By 174 BC, the games ran 3 full days. The bigger your father's funeral, the more important your family looked. Competitive grief became political advertising, and once Julius Caesar staged games for his dead father with 320 pairs of fighters, the arms race was effectively over. The games had become the most powerful tool in Roman politics, which brings us to the Colosseum itself, and what it was actually built to do. The building wasn't just a stadium. It was an instrument of social control, designed by architecture. The seating mapped the entire Roman hierarchy. At the arena level, 180 individual marble chairs, each carved with a senator's name, passed down through families for generations. The emperor watched from the pulvinar, a box positioned so that everyone in the building could see him watching. He wasn't just a spectator, he was part of the spectacle. At the very top, on wooden benches so far from the action that the depths below were barely visible, stood the poor, foreigners, slaves, and the people Rome considered the lowest of the low. Prostitutes, actors, and the families of gladiators themselves. Augustus passed actual laws about the seating. Soldiers separated from civilians, married men in their own section, women pushed to the highest rows. The seating chart was social engineering enforced by decree. But here's the detail that reframes everything. The arena was also one of the only places in Rome where ordinary people could talk back to power. The crowd could chant demands at the emperor: spare this fighter, lower the grain price, release this prisoner. And emperors who ignored those chants did so at genuine political risk. The fun was also a negotiation between ruler and ruled. The arena kept the peace. It let people feel heard. Bread and circuses wasn't just a phrase, it was a calculated system of crowd management. Now, here's where we get to the part that most videos skip entirely. The day at the arena had a structure. Animal hunts in the morning, gladiator fights in the afternoon, and in between, at lunchtime, came something else. The executions. Not executions in the sense of a quick death offstage. Public executions of condemned criminals, staged in the arena in front of the full crowd, with no pretense of sport or skill. The philosopher Seneca wandered into one of these lunchtime slots, expecting something lighter than the morning's animal hunts. He wrote about it afterward with visible horror. He said the morning fights were mercy by comparison. At noon, it was pure butchery. Unarmed men with no armor, no training, no chance. One killed only to make room for the next. And he noted chillingly that the crowd preferred this to skilled combat. But his deeper observation is the one that should stop you cold. Seneca said he came home from the games more cruel and more inhuman, because he had been among human beings. A Roman insider, 2,000 years ago, watching his own civilization, wrote down exactly what the arena was doing to the people inside it. He understood that watching cruelty made the watchers crueler. He diagnosed the moral cost in real time. And nobody listened. That's important, but it still isn't the darkest part. The Romans didn't just execute criminals at the arena. Sometimes they turned the executions into theater. Scholars call them fatal charades. A condemned prisoner would be dressed as a figure from Greek mythology, and then actually killed in a way that matched the myth. A man cast as Icarus would be thrown from a height to his real death. A prisoner playing Orpheus would play a lyre to tame animals, until a bear was released to maul him for real. A man playing Hercules would be burned alive to mirror Hercules' death by fire. The poet Martial wrote celebratory verses about these performances. About the Orpheus execution, he noted that everything matched the legend perfectly, except the ending. Because the real Orpheus charmed the beasts, this Orpheus was torn apart. Martial found the deviation from myth clever. Execution had been turned into literary entertainment with a punchline. And these deaths were reserved specifically for the lowest status people Rome recognized. Non-citizens, the humiliores. A Roman citizen was legally protected from dying this way. The manner of your death was a public statement about your legal worth as a human being. If you want to understand what the arena was actually about, it's this. It made the social hierarchy visible and absolute. Who watched from marble? Who watched from wood? Who died with a sword in their hand? Who died as a joke? Now here's the last piece, the one that almost nobody knows. Romans drank gladiator blood. Not as a ritual, not as a metaphor, as medicine. The encyclopedist Celsus, writing around 40 AD, records epileptics drinking the hot blood from the cut throat of a freshly killed gladiator as a cure for their condition. He called it a miserable remedy made tolerable only by a disease still more miserable. Pliny the Elder wrote that gladiator blood was drunk by epileptics as though it were the draught of life. The physician Scribonius Largus gave it a formal dosage, 3 spoonfuls over 30 days, and recommended eating the gladiator's liver as well. A folk superstition had been dressed up as formal medicine, and when gladiatorial combat was finally banned around 400 AD, the practice didn't stop. It just transferred to the blood of executed criminals, especially the beheaded. The arena ended. The superstition outlived it by 1,500 years. Versions of this practice persisted in European folk medicine into the 19th century. Some accounts push it into the 20th. So let's pull this all together. The Roman arena did not begin as entertainment. It began as a funeral rite and a human sacrifice. It became a political tool that kept emperors in power and crowds manageable. The gladiator fights that everyone pictures were the most regulated, most survivable, most expensive part of the whole event. The genuinely horrifying stuff was the lunchtime executions, the fatal charades, the hierarchy made flesh and blood in the seating chart. And a Roman philosopher sitting in that crowd 2,000 years ago already knew what it was doing to everyone inside. He wrote it down. He said watching cruelty made people crueler. He was right. And the crowds came back the next week anyway. That's not a story about Rome being uniquely barbaric. That's a story about what happens when power needs a distraction, when status needs to be performed publicly, and when human curiosity about death gets organized and sold back to us as spectacle. Rome just built a bigger building for it than anyone had before. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history is what you're here for, subscribe, because this channel goes exactly where most history content is afraid to. And if you want to keep going right now, the video on how the Roman Empire actually collapsed is right there. And the real answer is nothing like what you learned in school. Drop in the comments, did any of this genuinely surprise you? Because I want to know which part hit hardest. The arena is gone. The impulse that built it never really left.